I'm not used to, just the groaning of the snow under the car. That's, a new experience.
Yeah. You can definitely see we're not on stable ground. Also, it's just so dark.
The quiet is what always gets me.
Yeah. But, what sound do I hear? Democracy. From the New York Times, and for one last time from Iowa, I'm Ested Herndon. This is The Run-Up. Going into the night of the Iowa caucuses, where the first votes would be cast in this year's presidential election, I had been looking for three key things. The impact of the cold weather, Trump's strength and perceived dominance in Iowa, and finally, whether there would even be a contest to keep covering after Monday, or if a huge Trump victory would put an end to any fight in New Hampshire and beyond. So, a couple days have passed. We've defrosted a little bit, and we now have our answers.
All right, it's caucus time.
First, on the weather.
I know it's cold, but we need you out there. Wear some layers, bring your ID, and bring your friends. We can do this. Come on, Iowa. Let's finish this.
Iowans did brave sub-zero temperatures to come caucus, but not that many of them. There were only around 110,000 votes, 40% lower than the turnout in 2016, the last competitive Republican primary.
We can now make a very important projection.
The second question.
CNN projects that Donald Trump will win the Iowa caucuses. CNN can make this projection based on his overwhelming lead in our entrance poll of Iowa caucus goers. And
the polls weren't wrong. Trump won with 51% of the vote, beating his rivals by nearly 30 points, cementing his status as the race's overwhelming frontrunner.
So we're going to put America first. We're going to make America great again. Again, Iowa, we love you. You are going to, you just go out and buy larger tractors and more land. Don't worry about it.
That led me to my third question for caucus night. Was all this over before it got started? And what did Trump's commanding victory mean for the other candidates? Before we head to New Hampshire to answer that question, I wanted to spend just a little more time with voters in Iowa. Not Trump supporters, who got the result they wanted, but Republicans who were holding out hope for the non-Trump candidates and must now grapple with the uncomfortable reality of his dominance. So we drove to Ames, Iowa, for caucus night at the local high school. Interesting, though, at first glance, you do not see any Trump paraphernalia in this lobby. You see DeSantis 2024 signs, you see Pick Nikki signs. We're talking about Haley, but it's not as if we see any kind of Trump campaign things or things like that. Interesting. Ames is a suburb of Des Moines. It's the home of Iowa State University. But for me, it's actually more known for producing an impressive track record of NBA sharpshooters, like Harrison Barnes and Doug McDermott. Because of the university and its proximity to more liberal areas like Des Moines, it's not really known for being Trump country.
Well, welcome to the 11th Precinct Republican Caucus.
So, it was a good setting to explore the race for second place.
Did you all come here for the presidential poll?
But I also had a question for these type of Republican voters, the ones who would prefer a candidate other than Donald Trump. Now that Trump's dominance wasn't just projections and poll numbers, but actual physical votes, what was their plan? And what would they do if Trump did triumph?
Now it's time to vote. You should have all received your ballot.
At the caucus site, just before the outcome was announced, we met voters April and Troy Hill, who were sitting with their teenage sons. Hi, my name is Ted. This is Anna. We're from the New York Times. We host our politics podcast, and we're talking to people about why they came out today, kind of who they're thinking about caucusing for. Maybe you have 5-10 minutes for us to talk?
5-10 minutes?
If you care to.
How about 5 or less?
That's awesome. How long have you been in Story County for?
26 years.
So this is not y'all's first caucus.
No. Well, I think we've been to every caucus.
Do you have an issue that's the top of your priority list, or kind of how, amongst these candidates you have made a call between them?
We definitely have a priority list. Although there are a lot of things that seem really important right now, and I tend to be a little bit addicted to trying to be aware of what's going on in the world. For me, life is the issue. So for me, that defines everything else about a candidate. So how they value life, every life, whether it be unborn or somebody who's new to our country, or just every single life to me is important, and I would consider them an image bearer. So that really defines everything. And obviously there are a lot of Republican candidates that are saying that they're pro-life.
Yeah. I was going to ask, that would include all of them if you asked them that.
You would, unless you are Donald Trump and you like to call Ron DeSantis too pro-life, but yet he is responsible for the overturning of Roe. So I don't know. I just don't even know what that all means.
So I'm hearing some Trump's inconsistency on that has been really noticeable. Are you backing DeSantis in this caucus?
We are backing DeSantis, yes.
When did you make that decision, and when did he secure that vote?
We never really said we were committed to caucusing for him, but I think we've probably been in his camp all along. We sort of watched him really through COVID and just a lot of issues where things that would represent values that we have, he seems to be standing really strong for them and kind of unafraid of the consequences. And I'd rather not have a candidate that kind of blew wherever the wind was blowing. So,
is that in reference to Trump or Haley, or?
It could be either, and I'm honestly not sure, because sometimes you maybe don't know if they're lying or just saying what they think you want to hear. But occasionally I hear Trump say something that seems like an out-and-out lie to me, and I'm like, that also is inconsistent with my values.
I wanted to ask about kind of DeSantis' trajectory over the last 6 months. It certainly, I think they would even say it hasn't lived up to kind of what they wanted when he came in. Does any of that affect kind of how you viewed your own support? And what do you think has been the problem in terms of getting DeSantis to become the kind of Trump alternative that a lot of people thought he would be at the beginning?
I'm honestly not sure, but I feel like I almost wonder if the targeting of Trump from a legal perspective, which in my opinion is pretty bad, if I know that we know a lot of people that are Trump supporters, a lot. Really, the rest of our family would be supporting Trump in an Iowa caucus tonight. Not at this one, but somewhere else. And the more that he's targeted, the more that they don't even hear some of the things that he says, they are just not going to let this happen. So,
what would success be for DeSantis tonight?
Oh, winning, totally. If he loses, I'm not really sure what that means going forward. I feel like he has a better chance in Iowa than, say, New Hampshire. Yeah. So, I wouldn't say that's great, but he's also not that old. And you consider how old Trump and Biden are, and you consider how old Ron DeSantis is, and he's a great governor, maybe next time. And I've heard that from, say, my father-in-law, who's in his 80s. Not this time, but maybe next time. And I'm okay.
The last question would be would you have if it wasn't DeSantis, would you have a preference between Trump and Haley? On who the nominated?
Honestly, I think I'd probably take, I don't know, I might take Vivek over either of them. And they say he doesn't have a chance tonight, but you know what? Neither does Ron, so to speak. And again, the polls have been wrong in the last couple of cycles, so who knows? Why
Ramaswamy would be, just connect the dot for me?
I have a very close second pick, to be honest. He seems to be kind of all over the place at times. But having said that, our son did relief work in Ukraine until August, and prior to that in the Congo. And I think he's pro-Nikki, so he's thinks that she is more proven on foreign affairs or better at that. So, maybe if I had a second choice and I were listening to my son, I would vote for Nikki. I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. So
we only have a couple of minutes. I'm curious, do you have a moment when DeSantis became, you think, clearly your choice?
Yeah, for me, it's been between DeSantis and Trump. We voted Trump the last two elections. And I think he's right there with Reagan as far as his track record, what he did overall throughout his presidency. He finished up a little weak with some things. I think the biggest thing for Trump is being hampered by all the legal issues, and I just don't care to see that going into a presidency with him having it, because that can't help but divide your time.
I'm curious, is it the allegations of the legal issues, or is it just the drama and surrounding it for you that makes you think, I don't want all that?
I think it's more so just it seems it's going to be never ending, that the people that are going after him aren't going to stop. And that's why some are really digging their heels in and sticking with Trump. I will vote for Trump if he is and I won't feel bad about it, but I think DeSantis is our better choice, and I've thought that for quite some time.
If DeSantis finishes behind Haley tonight in Iowa, is there a path for him?
I don't think so.
It's going to be tough, and we haven't really believed the polls. And I think that's probably a pretty consistent thread throughout a lot of American. They're just, you kind of hear the stuff about the polls, and now I think we're just kind of calloused and numb toward them. I might be a little more optimistic, saying, hey, if he doesn't even finish top 3, who knows? Maybe if he keeps on going and gets some traction and momentum, I wouldn't put him out of it. But I think most would say it's a long shot. But I'm kind of one of those never-ending, hopeful, I think it's possible kind of thing.
What if Trump does win in Iowa tonight?
I think it would say to me that there are a lot of people like my father-in-law. He's a college graduate, but also a farmer. And my brother-in-law, my husband, teaches here at the high school, actually. But and they are very diehard Trump supporters, and they just love him. And to some extent, DeSantis is a theory. Nikki Haley is a theory. Vivek is a theory. Like, in theory, this is what they stand for. Now, for us, DeSantis, you can kind of see in his governorship. For Trump, they would say you could see what the U.S. looked like under his presidency. And so they're not going to back down from that. They are going to say he was a good president and we want him back. Yeah. They are going to be very heavily Trump.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's see how this goes.
Yeah.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
As the votes were counted and the precinct captain gave a speech, we also talked to an Iowan named Aaron, one of the younger caucus goers in the room.
Yeah. Are you in Story County? Are you here at the caucus?
Yes. Yep.
Who'd you caucus for?
So I voted for Nikki Haley.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm a firm believer in moderate Republican, candidates, and I think she has a lot of really good qualities. I think she is capable of standing up for what needs to be stood up for, and then I also just think she has the ability to really reach across the aisle in a way some of the other candidates maybe won't.
Yeah. Tell me about yourself. Are you a student? How old are you?
Yeah, so I'm 27 years old. I moved here about a year and a half ago. I've lived a few different places in the country, but I moved here for work. I do a little bit of work. This is my first caucus. It's interesting. I didn't really know what to expect. I appreciate the way it's ran, where individuals get to get up and speak on the candidate, but it's a little more controlled of a forum.
Yeah. What is your review now that you've gone through one?
Just at my table alone, talking to people I've never met before, clearly I live around them, but able to have a pretty civil conversation about the different candidates, who we support, and some of the strengths and weaknesses that we see in those candidates. So honestly, I think the table conversation was just as impactful, if not more, than the speakers that went up.
No, if you're someone who's been looking for a moderate, were you always with Nikki Haley when this race has been happening?
I was not, no. To be honest, I'm an Indiana boy. I grew up in Indiana. I was there when Mike Pence was governor, and I'm a big Mike Pence fan. I still would support him if he were running. But when he dropped out, I didn't know who I was going to go for. And honestly, some of the more recent campaigning that I've seen from the Haley campaign was what drew me in.
Would you vote for Trump if it's Trump Biden again?
I honestly have thought a lot about that, and I don't know what I would do. Yeah.
Well, what would you consider success for Nikki Haley in Iowa tonight?
I think the obvious answer would be a win. I think the realistic answer of what can you take away would be that second place spot. I think if she is able to get more votes than DeSantis, that sets her up for a good position. I think it really does set her up well as you do move on into some other states. It's a weird time to be where I don't think people are looking at as much the number one candidate that comes out of Iowa. They're really curious who is going to take that number 2 spot.
You know, there's some talk about whether Republicans have a young people problem or something like that. I'm curious as someone who's 27, you know, like how do you see kind of your generation's relationship with the Republican Party?
Yeah, I don't think the younger generation wants to not get excited about politics. I think there's an apathy due to the candidates that are getting put in place. And quite frankly, the age of the main candidates is...
Those people are there. It's just that, you know, the politics they want to see just seems I see how the apathy is fueled. I mean, you're saying if it's Trump Biden again, you don't know what you would do. Would you consider not voting or, yeah?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's definitely something I've considered.
Have you ever not voted in the presidential before?
I have not yet. I have thought of it before, but this would be the first time.
Yeah. Cool. It's great meeting you. Tell me your name.
Aaron.
That's
yes.
Good. Nice to meet you. After we finished talking to Aaron, the results of the caucus have been counted. And can you read them out for us, just for the audio?
Sure. Haley, 82, DeSantis, 42, Trump, 29, Vizik Ramaswamy, 17, Hutchinson, 1, and Brinkley, 1. A total of 172.
But Haley receiving 82. Cool. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And to specifically break down this precinct's results, we turn to a familiar voice who also caucused here.
We'd love to get your reaction to that. It seems like Haley.
I didn't hear it all, but
Teresa Garman, who we met over the summer, a former state legislator and a strong Ron DeSantis supporter.
I'm disappointed.
You thought DeSantis would do better?
No.
Why do you think Iowa came around to Trump? I mean, considering 2016,
I will say, I'm 86 years old. We've never had a better economy than we had under Trump. I just would like to have a president that I respected the way he treated people, but he did a great job as president as far as I'm concerned.
And that was the biggest reason.
That's the biggest reason.
Well, we'll look to see how the rest of the state goes, too. But just give us one last kind of final thought. Like,
whoever the Republican candidate is, I will be voting for them. We have got to change what's happening in this country. If we don't get control in the next election, we're going to be a socialist nation because we are headed in that direction.
So we're talking about second place, but the main story here is if Donald Trump wins again, you'll be voting for him in November.
Yes, I will be. I'll be voting for
Thank you so much. You've been so helpful for us.
You guys are great.
But at that point, we knew something Teresa didn't. Earlier in the night, as the local representative for the Trump campaign was giving a speech, we got a push notification declaring Trump the winner of the Iowa caucuses, before Teresa had her chance to vote for DeSantis or Aaron for Haley. It wasn't clear how many other people at our precinct and names knew that information before filling out their ballots. But Anna and I did. And to be honest, it felt a little weird.
So the big news organizations have just called the Iowa caucuses for Donald Trump, including the Associated Press, NBC, CBS. Now, at our caucus site, people haven't even voted yet, which they're doing so right now that the candidates have finished. But it speaks to just how big this margin might be, I guess, if these organizations are doing it that early. But I'm kind of confused considering, a whole bunch of people are about to get an alert to their phone that something is done that in their minds hasn't even started. But
yeah, it was, at this site right now, when you got that push alert, the representative for Donald Trump was speaking.
Yeah.
People were still hearing the argument for Trump.
Yeah. But, it's all across. The Times already published its story. So clearly, there is a level of confidence that across the state, that only further shows that this is really only a question about second and who will kind of go forward. If Donald Trump wins the Iowa caucuses by a big margin, I think in the same way that this has usually been a state that presents a multitude of options, it's going to be a state that really kicks off what is now looking like just a formal coronation.
There was so much buildup to the Iowa Republican caucus, only for it essentially to be over before some Iowans even cast their votes. That felt like a fitting ending to this particular contest. Trump broke all of Iowa's supposed rules. He skipped the debates, did far less traditional campaigning, and didn't cater to the state's evangelical leaders on issues like abortion. But still, in a state that was supposed to be a springboard for his rivals, no one could come close. Later on caucus night, Vivek Ramaswamy, the right-wing businessman who placed fourth in the caucuses, announced that he was suspending his campaign and would be endorsing Trump. Trump's good night had gotten even better. And the idea that this Republican primary could be a march to the inevitable had never seemed more true. That is, unless New Hampshire does something weird. That's after the break. For the past month, the biggest political storyline in the Republican primary has been Nikki Haley's rise in New Hampshire, where she was starting the poll pretty close to Donald Trump. But if anyone had a bad night in Iowa, it was probably her, considering she finished third to Ron DeSantis. So I wanted to get a sense of how Iowa could affect New Hampshire, and whether Donald Trump's dominance or Haley's slight disappointment were shifting the landscape. To do that, hey, I'm glad we're able to do this. How are you doing?
Yeah. Oh, holding it down.
I called my colleague, Nick Corasaniti, who's been focusing his coverage on the New Hampshire primary and has been there all week. So, Nick, I know you had a late night at the Trump event in New Hampshire last night. What was the energy there like? Just generally paint the scene of what I hear was a cold night in New Hampshire, though. I mean, considering I just survived negative 30 something, I'm not feeling too bad for the coldness there.
Yeah, I mean, cold is relative, right? We were in the balmy mid-20s in southeastern New Hampshire, but there was a ton of sleet, ice. There was probably about 8 inches of snow on the ground. When I arrived, I was about 2.5 hours early before Trump's scheduled start time, and there was already a line of about 300 people waiting in this wet and frozen parking lot, snaking down.
2.5 hours early.
2.5 hours early. Mm-hmm. And there was like this kind of palpable excitement. There's always these lines at Trump events. I mean, I've been going to these, since 2015, and there's the excited many who come and wait in line, and it almost becomes a little bit of its own tailgate. But there was even more excitement yesterday, I think, because everyone was still very excited about the Iowa victory. And you could feel that as soon as you walked in the room. There was a buzz like, yeah, we just won. Like, I feel great. He's going to win. It gave us, the signal that we needed that this is off to, the march to the nomination. And I'd be talking to voters and I'd be like, how long do you wait outside? And they'd say, 2 hours, but it was worth it. Every single one of them had to qualify that, like, the line was worth it.
I think that's really interesting because, to your point, as we have talked to people who have seen Trump on the road over the last 6 months, they have mentioned the kind of lack of energy that has become associated with his rallies, say in 2016 or 2020, that maybe there was like a more sleepy nature to this version of the Trump campaign. But it does sound like at least winning in Iowa or making the polling lead more clear and tangible, as Monday did, seemed to have energized some folks, at least in the place you were yesterday.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it gave them confidence, right? Like, Iowa was always a foregone conclusion. It was just a question of how big was the victory going to be. And, him being over 50%, 30 points higher than DeSantis and Haley, I think gave a lot of voters here that extra confidence that, like, he can win in New Hampshire. Because it had been somewhat of an open question. I mean, he certainly is leading here in every single poll. Nothing has showed him not leading. And his lead over Nikki Haley has always been well outside of the margin of error. But there was that slim, narrow path that showed Haley had a possibility of winning here. Yet everyone I talked to at the event yesterday had no doubts that Trump would win New Hampshire and win easily. And when I'd ask why, one of the main reasons they would point to was like, well, just look at last night.
So as you mentioned, this is a big state for Nikki Haley. The campaign has put a lot of attention onto New Hampshire. And even after the Iowa results, in her speech that night, she made very clear that she still sees this as a two-person race and that New Hampshire would really prove that. I guess my question is like, Nikki Haley's case in New Hampshire has a lot to do with her appeal to independence in the state. Can you describe what the New Hampshire independent looks like or sounds like, what their priorities are? Because how should I think of New Hampshire independents as different than your classic swing voter or moderate?
I think what's unique about New Hampshire's independent voters, which are technically undeclared, they're just unaffiliated, so then they can register on the same day as the primary to whichever they want to participate in, is that they really stretch across a broad swath of the political spectrum. You have some who are going to be real libertarians, some who are going to actually be big Trump supporters who just never felt a part of the Republican Party or any party, but are drawn to Trump and what Trump has turned the party into. There's a lot that are pretty moderate, that, again, don't feel ties to either party. They tend to be, much more on the libertarian side, but not necessarily so far that they support someone like a Rand Paul or Trump. And then there's some who are also, kind of Democratic leaning. And they normally would vote for a Democrat in a general election, but in a 2024 primary where there's only a Republican primary, they want their vote to count, so they'll participate in the Republican primary. So it really is this kind of undefinable sum that makes up the majority of voters. And I think that's also what creates the uncertainty that is, kind of overshadowing the New Hampshire primary, whereas Iowa was, a foregone conclusion before voters even cast their votes.
Yeah. I remember Haley saying in New Hampshire that she could see that state correcting Iowa's result, which actually got her a lot of stick in Iowa. DeSantis even made a whole negative ad about it. But it does imply that the state really marches to a beat of its own drum rather than necessarily follow what went before it. You mentioned that people were mentioning Iowa's result at the Trump rally that you were just at. But I guess I'm thinking more broadly, should we think of New Hampshire as some place that will cut against the grain? Or is it that, the same levels, the same momentum we're seeing come from Monday, you expect to continue come next Tuesday in their primary?
So New Hampshire has a long history of really just going against Iowa, right? Yeah. It's not since 1976 that a Republican in an open competitive primary has won both Iowa and New Hampshire, which, President Trump is trying to do this time.
Wait, I didn't know that fact. Since 1976, no one has won in an open competitive primary, both Iowa and New Hampshire on the Republican side.
Yes.
Interesting.
So this has the potential to be that first time. Now, New Hampshire also has a long history of delivering surprise results, but they don't always portend a march to the nomination, right? Like if you look at 1992, Bill Clinton has a big surge in New Hampshire, and that's what kind of sets him off to eventually getting the nomination. And he points back to New Hampshire, as what did it for him. In 2000.
Isn't that the comeback kid thing?
That's the comeback kid. There's a whole era of politics that was kind of sparked by New Hampshire then.
Yeah.
If you go to 2000, Senator John McCain had a surprise victory here. And it looked like, maybe, George W. Bush, who was the front runner, isn't going to walk away with this thing. And then, sure enough, he did. And that just proved to be a little blip. So it could certainly go one of two ways. But New Hampshire certainly has a history of delivering surprising results. And again, a lot of that could be due to the large swath of undeclared voters. Those independents is where, the question of the final results really, really come in.
Mm-hmm. It kind of changes the calculus for the candidates and campaigns. And you have to kind of win some independents to really have a shot at finishing at the top of the heap. And while Trump has some of those people, and we should not just think of independent and moderate as necessarily the same thing, Nikki Haley's strategy is much more dependent on turning those people into her voters. She's targeting them maybe even more than Trump, who feels better about his position with regular Republicans. Is that true?
Yeah, I've spoken to a lot of veteran New Hampshire Republican operatives who have said that this is shaping up to be almost a fight between the registered Republicans here and then the larger sect of independent voters. Registered Republicans seem to be the majority with former President Trump, and the independents are probably the majority with Nikki Haley, especially when we look at polling. But where that kind of middle slice breaks is, I think, where the battle is, and Haley is aggressively courting those, as are her allies like Americans for Prosperity Action. They've been out knocking doors on unaffiliated voters who would be considered likely to vote in the Republican primary, and their independent polling also shows that once this becomes a quote unquote two-person race in New Hampshire, it tightens and more of those independents do break towards Nikki Haley. Their most recent polling, which is in December, found that if it was a full field, Haley was losing to Trump. But if it was just Haley and Trump, then she was within the margin of error. So that shows how much, those independent voters could also be breaking late.
It's not a one-on-one matchup, though. That's my first thought when I hear that, is that she does still have this kind of the annoyance that is the Ron DeSantis campaign that is still sticking around and finished ahead of her in Iowa. Is there any difficulty for Haley to really consolidate this and present it as a one-on-one matchup, considering she did have a somewhat disappointing result in Iowa, which placed her third behind Ron DeSantis?
Sure. There's actually two, I guess, annoyances or things that might be blocking that two-person race from exactly happening. The first is, as you mentioned, Governor DeSantis, who finished ahead of her in Iowa. And while he hasn't necessarily put a lot of effort into New Hampshire, at least the same way he did Iowa, right? He moved his headquarters to Iowa. He put his staff in Iowa. He hasn't done that in New Hampshire. He's certainly campaigned here plenty. And so when you look at what that has in the polls, he's been in the mid to high single digits. Now, that's certainly enough to eat into a Haley lead, but also you don't know if those voters necessarily break towards Haley. The bigger impediment for her was former Governor Chris Christie. And when he was in the race, he was polling, 15, about maybe 12. And he was definitely taking some of her supporters away. Now, internal polling that I've gotten from the Christie campaign showed that the majority of their voters would go to Haley if Christie got out, which he did, last week. But that's not all of them. There's actually, shockingly, a small slice of Christie voters that will go to Trump, which even the Christie campaign was pretty surprised by.
Yeah,
you wonder,
it's one of those facts where I'm like, I need to see that person and look them in their eyes, like what would be the thing that causes you to go for the Trump is killing democracy guy and then go to the killing democracy guy in Christie's language.
Yeah, those are the voters that if you find, it's the most fascinating interview. And, I hope to find them at the Trump rally tonight in Portsmouth.
Yeah.
But within that Christie polling, they also found a decent number, not a majority, but a decent number of their supporters who were undecided once he got out. And some of them may eventually break for Haley, though not enthusiastically, because it'd be an anti-Trump vote. And then some of them might just stay home because they found, as Christie has said on the stump and Christie advisors have told me about, they view both Haley and DeSantis as not fervently enough anti-Trump. They've said they would pardon him, or even Haley said she wouldn't turn down the opportunity of being his vice president. And that has turned off some of those Christie supporters. So as Christie strategists have told me, it's a fallacy to just stack Christie's number on top of Haley's and then show oh, look, she's tied with Trump right now, because that just won't happen.
You covered Chris Christie for years, and that was someone who kind of had the most clear-eyed anti-Trump message in this race that got some traction in New Hampshire, but not really enough, and didn't actually sustain him to be able to, obviously, to continue his campaign through the New Hampshire primary. But you've seen that kind of anti-Trump messaging in the Republican Party up close. Why don't you think the Christies of the world were able to make significant traction with that message?
Well, I think it's for exactly, what we saw in Iowa and what we've seen in all these polls is that the base of the Republican Party is still so strongly with Trump that such, virulent criticism, strident criticism that would come from Governor Christie just immediately turned them off. And there wasn't even enough of margins of the Republican base that was available for Christie to win over with his arguments. Now, New Hampshire presented him that opportunity to win over the independents, to win over the moderates who do want to move on from Trump. And, when I spoke to Christie, back in the fall here and anytime I saw him around the state, he would say, hey, if I win here, then that changes everything. It gives
a lot of people are saying that.
Exactly. They believe that a victory here gives
if
other
I was
voters
6'5", I'd be in the NBA, we would all be living different lives.
Yeah, exactly. And they believe that, it gives voters permission to break from Trump. But as we've seen, a lot of Republican voters aren't looking for that permission. They're with Trump.
Mm-hmm. So when you think about the early states, how would you describe the difference between a New Hampshire voter and an Iowa voter?
Well, everyone makes a lot of the Iowa nice voter, right? They're taken aback by how warm and friendly they are and willing to talk to everyone. And New Hampshire has what I call they really are this live free or die, libertarian streak, they're certainly willing to talk to you. You know, they're as engaged a voter as you find in Iowa because they get the same kind of access to candidates, so they get the same familiarity with the media. But their responses can be blunter, can be much more direct. They're definitely very different, right? They're not necessarily like evangelicals or Christians. You get a lot more in your face. There's a lot of unprintable profanity that I'll get sometimes that I have to, work around, as I got yesterday with a lot of very amped up and excited voters, pumped after the Iowa victory. I think they were letting their language slip a little bit. And they're proud of that, kind of live free or die mentality that governs New Hampshire politics. And it speaks to the kind of issues that they want to talk about. Like every voter I talked to yesterday not a single one brought up abortion. Everyone brought up the economy that was humming under former President Trump. And multiple voters used that word, either humming or motoring. That was like what they heard and that's what they felt. They were economic voters, taxation voters, pro-gun voters, not any of those kind of evangelical issues that we heard in Iowa.
It does lend itself to is if you can win among the evangelical base in Iowa and win among a more libertarian, pro-gun, Second Amendment base in New Hampshire, I mean, that's it. That's the Republican Party, at some point. At some point, the other candidates have to deal with that. Yeah.
It's a pretty broad coalition that doesn't offer many cracks to, be able to win over a majority of voters. And I guess we'll really see whether Trump's able to stitch together that coalition here in New Hampshire with those undeclared voters here.
Thank you so much for your time, Nick. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks for having me.
That's the run-up for Thursday, January 18th, 2024. Now, the rundown.
And I think it's very clear who the Republican primary electorate is saying that they want to be their nominee.
On Tuesday morning, fresh off his exit from the race, Vivek Ramaswamy landed in New Hampshire to join Donald Trump on the trail. And during an appearance on Fox News, he called on other candidates to step aside.
You're calling on Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis to drop out right now. I am. And I do think that would be healthy for this country. And I think that, especially Ron DeSantis, at least of the two of them, will have an important role to play in the future of this country and leading this nation. I do believe that. But I think that the right thing to
Ron DeSantis is still pressing on. By Tuesday morning, the Florida governor had arrived in South Carolina, signaling that his new political aim is to beat Haley in her home state. Nikki Haley, meantime, is courting New Hampshire's independent voters, her best shot at coming out ahead of Trump. Also on Tuesday, the last anti-Trump voice in the race, former Arkansas Governor Asa Hutchinson, suspended his long-shot campaign for president, leaving only 3 candidates competing for New Hampshire. As it stands, 20 presidential delegates have been pledged to Donald Trump. DeSantis has 9, and Haley 8. To clinch the nomination, candidates need to win a majority of the party's overall delegates, which amounts to 1,215. There are 292 days until the general election. We'll see you back here on Tuesday for a special New Hampshire Primary Day episode of The Run-Up. The Run-Up is reported by me, Ested Herndon, and produced by Lisa Gutierrez, Caitlin O'Keefe, and Anna Foley. It's edited by Rachel Dry, Lisa Tobin, and Franny Kartoff, with original music by Dan Powell, Marian Lozano, Pat McCusker, Diane Wong, Sophia Landman, and Elishaba Itu. It was mixed by Sophia Landman and fact-checked by Will Peischel. Special thanks to Paula Schumann, Sam Dolnick, Larissa Anderson, David Halfinger, Mahima Chablani, Tara Godvin, Jeffrey Miranda, and Maddie Masiello. Do you have a question about the 2024 election? Email us at therunup@nytimes.com. Or better yet, record your question using the voice memo app on your phone, and then send us a file. That email again is therunup@nytimes.com. And finally, if you like the show and want to get updates on latest episodes, follow our feed wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening, y'all.